The crisp autumn wind whipped through the Manhattan streets as the sun began its descent behind the towering skyscrapers. The sidewalks buzzed with the usual evening crowd, business people rushing home, tourists snapping photos, and street vendors packing up their carts for the day. Outside Trump Tower, the security personnel stood alert as they prepared for their boss's departure. Inside the Golden Building, Donald Trump was wrapping up a series of meetings. He adjusted his signature red tie in the elevator's reflection, mentally preparing for the gauntlet of photographers he knew would be waiting outside. It had been a long day of business discussions, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening. As he stepped through the building's heavy glass doors, the familiar flash of cameras greeted him. The security team moved with practiced precision, creating a path through the small crowd that had gathered. But something caught Trump's attention, something that made him pause mid-stride. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of a building's doorway, sat a figure that seemed out of place in the glossy Manhattan landscape. Even from a distance, there was something distinctly military about their bearing. Despite wearing worn civilian clothes, the person sat with the kind of straight-backed posture that only comes from years of service. Trump's security detail gently tried to guide him toward the waiting black SUV, but he remained rooted in place, his eyes fixed on the doorway. The figure was a woman, probably in her mid-40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun despite her circumstances. What caught his eye wasn't just her posture. It was the collection of service pins carefully arranged on her weathered jacket. "Sir, we need to keep moving," his head of security murmured, but Trump was already taking a step in the opposite direction, toward the street. The security team exchanged worried glances. This wasn't in the protocol. The woman hadn't noticed them yet, focused instead on carefully arranging her few possessions in a worn military backpack. As Trump approached the street corner, the evening crowd began to take notice. Foams emerged from pockets, and whispers rippled through the gathering onlookers. The woman looked up at the growing commotion, and for a moment her eyes met Trump's. There was no recognition of his status, no sudden excitement or fear, just the level gaze of someone who had seen enough of life to remain unimpressed by titles or wealth. Something in that gaze struck Trump. It reminded him of the many veterans he'd met during his presidency, men and women who carried themselves with dignity regardless of their circumstances. He saw in her eyes the same pride, the same strength, but also a weariness that spoke of battles fought long after leaving the battlefield. Against his security team's increasingly urgent whispers, Trump crossed the street. Traffic had already been stopped for his motorcade, creating an unusual moment of stillness in the typically bustling Manhattan intersection. The woman watched his approach with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to expect nothing from life's surprises. As he got closer, Trump could see more details: the combat boots, worn but meticulously clean, the military ID tags hanging around her neck, the small American flag patch on her backpack that had faded but remained carefully stitched in place. She began to stand, that military bearing taking over even in this unexpected situation. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, phones still recording, as Trump stopped a respectful distance from the doorway. For a moment, no one moved. Two unlikely paths crossing on a Manhattan street corner, one man who had lived in a tower of gold, and one woman who had served her country only to end up seeking shelter in its shadows. The security team formed a loose perimeter, their practiced movements creating a small bubble of privacy in the middle of the busy street. As the last rays of sunlight caught the golden letters of Trump Tower behind them, the former president did something that would soon capture the nation's attention. He simply asked, "Would you tell me your story?" What happened next would not only change two lives, but spark a conversation that America needed to have about those who served their country, only to find themselves forgotten when they returned home. The veteran straightened her uniform jacket instinctively as she rose to her feet, a habit ingrained from years of military service. Her movements were precise despite the obvious stiffness in her joints from hours of sitting in the cold doorway. The small collection of service pins on her jacket caught the fading sunlight, telling a story of sacrifice and duty that needed no words. 3 tours, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of steadiness that comes from keeping emotions carefully in check. She didn't elaborate on where those tours were, but the ribbons on her jacket spoke of Afghanistan and Iraq. Her fingers unconsciously traced the combat service pin as she spoke, a gesture Trump had seen countless times from veterans remembering moments they carried with them always. The growing crowd of onlookers maintained a respectful distance, held back by both the security detail and the gravity of the moment that they were witnessing. Some lowered their phones, sensing that this wasn't a moment for social media, but rather something more genuine unfolding on the streets of Manhattan. Trump noticed how she stood, at perfect parade rest, despite wearing civilian clothes and despite her current circumstances. It was the stance of someone who had led others, who had carried responsibilities that most civilians couldn't comprehend. Her backpack sat beside her, packed with military precision, each item likely having its designated place just as it would in the field. "I was a combat medic," she continued, and Trump could see her eyes drift momentarily, perhaps to memories of those she'd helped, those she'd saved, and possibly those she couldn't. Served 15 years before. She paused, choosing her words carefully, before things got complicated back home. The evening had grown colder, and Trump noticed her suppressing a shiver. Without hesitation, he removed his suit jacket, but before he could offer it, she gave a slight shake of her head. That military pride was still there, unbending even in the face of hardship. It was a familiar sight to Trump, who had met many veterans during his presidency who would rather stand tall in difficulty than accept what they saw as charity. A nearby street vendor, who had been watching the scene unfold, quietly approached with a cup of hot coffee. The security team tensed, but Trump nodded, allowing the small gesture of kindness to pass through their perimeter. The veteran accepted the coffee with a quiet thank you that carried the weight of someone unused to accepting help. "How long have you been out here?" Trump asked, his usual bold demeanor softened by the reality of the situation before him. The question hung in the air as the veteran took a sip of coffee, her hands wrapping around the warm cup. 3 months on these streets," she replied, then added with a hint of dry humor, "though I've had worse accommodations in the service." The small joke didn't mask the seriousness of her situation, but it showed a resilience that had clearly helped her survive both war zones and city streets. The security team shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to their principal spending this much time in an exposed position on a public street. But Trump remained focused on the veteran before him, watching as she automatically squared her shoulders before continuing her story. She spoke of the challenges that followed her return home, the memories that wouldn't fade, the difficulty of translating combat medical skills to civilian certifications, the system that seemed designed to test the very patience that military service had instilled. Her words weren't bitter, just matter-of-fact, as if she were delivering a mission report rather than sharing her personal struggles. As she talked, Trump noticed other details: the military-grade watch still on her wrist, the way she constantly scanned her surroundings, a habit that probably saved lives overseas, and the military ID tags that she still wore under her clothes, visible only when she leaned forward to emphasize a point. The gathering darkness brought a sharper chill to the air, and the city lights began to flicker on around them. In the growing shadows, the differences between the former president and the homeless veteran seemed to fade, leaving just 2 Americans having a conversation that was long overdue, about service, sacrifice, and what happens when warriors come home to find their battles aren't over. What started as a chance encounter was about to become something much more significant, though neither of them knew it yet. The head of Trump's security team stepped forward, gently touching his earpiece. "Sir, we really need to move now," he said in a low voice. The growing crowd and extended exposure on the street were making the security detail increasingly nervous. But Trump held up his hand, the same gesture he used countless times during his presidency when he was about to break from the carefully planned script. "Change of plans," Trump said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of decision that his staff had learned meant there was no point in arguing. The veteran watched this exchange with the quiet assessment of someone who understood chain of command and the delicate dance between security protocols and human moments. The crowd had grown larger now, with office workers pausing on their way home and tourists gathering at a respectful distance. Phones still recorded the scene, but there was something different about the atmosphere, a sense that they were witnessing not a political moment, but a human one. Trump turned to his chief of staff, who was already pulling out his phone, anticipating instructions. "Call the kitchen at Trump Tower," he said, then looked back at the veteran. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" The question wasn't patronizing. It was direct, businessmanlike, the same tone he'd used in countless negotiations. The veteran's expression remained composed, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps surprise at the suddenness of it all. "I manage," she replied diplomatically, the kind of answer that said everything by saying nothing. Trump recognized it as the same kind of response he'd heard from proud service members who wouldn't admit to needing help. Secret Service agents were now repositioning themselves, adapting to this unplanned situation with professional efficiency. One spoke quietly into his wrist mic, likely coordinating with the tower's security team. The street vendor who had provided the coffee earlier was now packing up his cart, but smiling, clearly pleased to be witnessing this unexpected turn of events. "Here's what's going to happen," Trump said, using the same tone he'd become famous for in his business dealings. "You're going to have dinner with me, and we're going to talk about how we fix this. Not just for you, for all the veterans who end up on these streets." The veteran's military bearing faltered slightly, genuine surprise breaking through her careful composure. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but—" she began, but Trump interrupted with a gentle wave of his hand. "This isn't charity," he said, understanding the pride that made her hesitate. "This is a consultation. I need to hear the real story, not from politicians, not from reports, but from someone who's living it. Consider it a briefing. You're still serving your country, just in a different way now." These words seemed to resonate with the veteran. The idea of service, of duty, was something that ran deeper than any current circumstance. She looked at her worn backpack, then back at Trump, making a decision that felt as important as any she'd made in the field. A light drizzle had begun to fall, giving the city lights a soft, blurred quality. The evening traffic continued to flow around their small scene, horns honking in the distance, the usual symphony of New York City creating a backdrop to this unusual moment. Trump's security team had already begun to adjust, 2 agents moving to discreetly check the veteran's backpack, while others coordinated with Trump Tower security. They maintained their professionalism, treating the veteran with the respect due to both her service and her current situation. The veteran squared her shoulders, meeting Trump's gaze directly. "If you really want to know what's happening on these streets, sir, I'll tell you. But I won't sugarcoat it. The truth isn't pretty." Trump nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a service member." He gestured toward the tower's entrance. "Shall we?" The simple question carried the weight of change, not just for one veteran on one cold New York evening, but potentially for thousands more across the country. As they walked toward Trump Tower, the crowd parted naturally, phones still recording what would soon become a viral moment. But unlike many viral moments, this one wasn't about spectacle or politics. It was about something more basic, more human. The simple act of stopping to listen to someone's story. The private dining room in Trump Tower felt worlds away from the street corner they'd just left. Golden curtains framed the city lights beyond the windows, and the veteran's worn boots made no sound on the thick carpet. She sat with military precision in the offered chair, her backpack placed carefully beside her. The kitchen had responded quickly to Trump's request, and the aroma of warm food filled the room. The veteran's face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion at the sight of the hot meal placed before her. Still, she waited, hands folded in her lap, until Trump gestured for her to begin. "Tell me everything," Trump said, settling into his chair. Start from the beginning. His usual commanding presence had softened into something more patient, more attentive. The security team had positioned themselves discreetly by the doors, trying to be invisible but unable to completely fade into the background. The veteran took a careful sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "I enlisted right after high school," she began, her voice steady. "Wanted to be a combat medic because I believed in saving lives." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "Never imagined I'd end up trying to save my own." As she spoke, her story unfolded like a map of battlefields, both foreign and domestic. She described the adrenaline rush of evacuating wounded soldiers under fire, the weight of responsibility in making split-second decisions that meant life or death. But then her voice changed as she talked about coming home. "The nightmares started first," she admitted, her hands tightening slightly around her water glass. "You train for combat, but nobody trains you for the memories." Trump leaned forward, listening intently as she described the challenges that followed. The difficulty sleeping, the struggle to connect with people who couldn't understand what she'd seen. "I held it together for a while," she continued, taking small, deliberate bites of her meal between sentences. "Had a job at a private ambulance company. But then the pandemic hit." Her words carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting events as they happened. She described how the sound of sirens during the height of COVID-19 triggered memories of combat evacuations, how the sight of overflowing emergency rooms brought back images she tried to forget. "I started making mistakes," she said quietly. "Nothing serious, but enough that I knew I needed help." Trump nodded, understanding written on his face. He'd heard similar stories during his presidency, but somehow this one, told over a dinner table rather than in a briefing room, felt more real, more urgent. The veteran explained the complicated maze of veteran services she'd encountered, the endless paperwork, the long wait times, the programs that seemed designed to test patients rather than provide help. "You learn in the military to never leave anyone behind," she said, a hint of bitter irony in her voice. "Feels different when you're the one being left behind." She spoke about the community of homeless veterans she'd met on the streets, former surgeons, lieutenants, and specialists who now shared tips about safe places to sleep and which shelters had the shortest waiting lists. "We still look out for each other," she said with a small smile. "Old habits die hard." As she talked, Trump's expression grew more serious. He'd made promises about veteran care during his presidency, but here, facing the reality of those promises in human form, the gap between policy and reality became starkly clear. The veteran finished her meal but continued her story, describing how she still tried to help others on the street, using her medical training to treat minor injuries and illnesses among the homeless community. "Can't stop being a medic," she said, that slight smile returning, even without the uniform. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, and the dinner plates had long since been cleared, but the conversation continued. Trump asked questions, not for political soundbites or photo opportunities, but with genuine interest in understanding the complex web of challenges that had led a decorated combat medic to seek shelter in a Manhattan doorway. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a story about one veteran's journey. It was a window into a larger issue that demanded attention, not just from politicians and policymakers, but from every American who believed in honoring those who served. Trump leaned back in his chair, his face showing the kind of determination that had defined his business career. The veteran's story had struck a chord deeper than any briefing or report ever could. The dining room had grown quiet, with only the distant hum of the city filtering through the windows. "You know," Trump began, his voice unusually soft, "I've sat through hundreds of meetings about veteran care, signed countless documents, made dozens of speeches." He shook his head slowly. "But nothing tells the real story like hearing it firsthand." The veteran watched him carefully, years of military training making her attentive to every shift in expression, every change in tone. She'd seen enough empty promises in her time to recognize when someone was merely paying lip service to a cause. "I'm not looking for handouts," she said firmly, her posture remaining straight despite hours of conversation. "None of us are. We just want the chance to rebuild our lives with the same dignity we served with." Trump stood suddenly, walking to the window. The city stretched out below, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, other veterans were preparing to spend another night on the streets. The thought seemed to weigh heavily on him. "What if we did something different?" he said, turning back to face the veteran. "Not just another program, not just another policy." His voice carried the energy that had made him famous in the business world. "What if we created something that actually works?" The veteran's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed interest. She'd heard grand promises before, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the informal setting, away from cameras and political advisors, or maybe it was the genuine anger that had flashed across Trump's face as she described the bureaucratic maze that had failed so many veterans. "With all due respect, sir," she said carefully, "what makes this different from all the other promises?" The question wasn't challenging. It was practical, the kind of direct inquiry you'd expect from someone trained to assess situations critically. Trump smiled, recognizing the military straightforwardness in her question. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began typing rapidly. "Because we're starting right now, right here." His fingers moved across the screen with purpose. No committees, no research papers, no waiting for approval. The veteran watched as he made several calls, speaking in short, decisive sentences. Each call ended with clear instructions and specific deadlines. The security team exchanged glances. They'd seen this side of Trump before, when he decided to cut through red tape and make things happen immediately. "First," he said, putting down his phone, "you're not spending another night on the street. That's non-negotiable." Before the veteran could protest, he continued, "And before you object, consider this an investment in our future project." The veteran's military training warred visibly with her pride. Trump recognized the internal struggle and added, "I need your help to fix this broken system. Consider it a mission, not a handout." Those words seemed to shift something in the veteran's perspective. A mission was something she understood, something that aligned with her military background and sense of purpose. "Here's my promise to you," Trump continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine commitment. "We're going to create a system that works. No more endless paperwork, no more waiting months for basic help, and you're going to help me design it, because you've lived it." The veteran straightened even further in her chair, if that was possible. The idea of being part of a solution, rather than just another statistic in the system, sparked something in her eyes, a glimmer of the leader she'd been in combat. "If you're serious about this, sir," she said, her voice taking on the tone of a military briefing, "there are things you need to understand about what's really happening on the ground." Trump pulled his chair closer, grabbing a notepad from a nearby side table. "Tell me everything. And this time, we're not just listening. We're taking action." The city continued its nighttime bustle outside, unaware that in a quiet dining room high above its streets, a chance encounter was transforming into something that would change countless lives. The next few hours moved with the precision of a military operation. Trump's phone barely stopped ringing as he made call after call, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to making things happen quickly. The veteran watched with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope as plans began taking shape in real time. "Get me the manager of the Plaza Hotel," Trump said into his phone, his free hand scribbling notes from their earlier conversation. The veteran started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Trust me on this." Within minutes, arrangements were made for a comfortable room, not just for one night, but for as long as needed. But Trump wasn't stopping there. His next call was to a former military officer who now ran one of the city's largest private security firms. "Remember when we talked about hiring veterans?" The conversation was brief but productive. "They need someone with medical training and leadership experience," he said, glancing at the veteran. "I think I've found the perfect candidate." The veteran sat straighter, her military bearing impossible to hide even after hours of conversation. She watched as Trump moved through his contacts with purpose, each call building on the last, creating not just a plan for her, but a blueprint for something larger. A young staff member hurried in with a laptop, setting it up quickly before disappearing again. Trump turned the screen toward the veteran, showing her a database of veteran-owned businesses and support organizations. "Pick the ones you know are actually helping," he said, "not the ones that just look good on paper." The veteran leaned forward, her expertise suddenly valuable in a way it hadn't been in months. She pointed out organizations she'd encountered during her time on the streets, ones that provided real help without endless paperwork, ones that understood what veterans really needed. Trump's chief of staff appeared with documents requiring signatures, emergency fund allocations, preliminary proposals for new veteran support initiatives. The veteran watched as each paper was signed with Trump's distinctive signature, each document representing another piece of immediate action rather than distant promises. "We're not just getting you off the streets," Trump explained as he signed. "We're creating a model that works, something we can repeat." His pen moved across the papers with purpose. "But we need your help to do it right." The veteran nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. This wasn't charity. It was a mission, something she understood deep in her bones. Trump was offering her a chance to serve again, this time by helping other veterans navigate the challenges she'd faced. A staff member brought in fresh coffee and water, and the veteran noticed her hands were steadier now as she reached for the cup. Hours had passed since their chance encounter on the street, but the energy in the room hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger as plans took shape and possibilities expanded. "The car will be here in 10 minutes," Trump's security chief announced quietly. The veteran glanced at her worn backpack, containing everything she owned, and then back at the stack of papers on the table, papers that represented not just her future, but potentially the futures of countless other veterans. Trump stood, straightening his tie. "Tomorrow, we start the real work," he said. "Tonight, you rest." "That's an order." The slight smile he added took any sting out of the words, making them feel more like care than command. The veteran rose too, military habit making the movement automatic. "Sir," she began, then paused, searching for words that could express the magnitude of what had happened in just a few hours. Trump understood. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when we fix this for everyone still out there." He gestured to the city lights beyond the windows. "This is just the beginning." As they prepared to leave the room, the veteran caught her reflection in the window. The same person she'd been that morning, but somehow different. In her eyes now was something that had been missing on the streets. Purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was back on mission. The city had grown quiet outside, but inside Trump Tower, wheels were in motion that would keep turning long after this night ended. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a chance encounter on a Manhattan street corner. Word spread through the city like a gentle wave, not through press releases or official statements, but through the authentic voices of those who had witnessed the encounter. The street vendor who had offered coffee was the first to share his video, capturing the moment when a former president stopped to listen to a homeless veteran's story. The hotel staff who had welcomed the veteran late that night shared their experience too, not of a publicity stunt, but of a tired soldier finally finding a moment of peace. Their stories painted a picture of genuine human connection that resonated far beyond the usual social media buzz. By morning, small groups of people had gathered near the spot where the encounter had taken place. Some brought coffee and sandwiches to share with other homeless veterans in the area. Others left notes of support, turning the doorway into an impromptu memorial to forgotten heroes. A young couple who ran a local diner noticed the gathering and opened their doors early, offering free breakfast to any veteran who needed it. They didn't do it for publicity. They did it because something about the previous night's events had reminded them of their own grandfather, who had struggled after returning from war. The security guard who had been on duty during the encounter shared his perspective with a local news blogger. He described how Trump had waved off the usual protocols, choosing instead to listen to someone society had overlooked. The guard's words carried weight because they weren't polished or prepared. They were real, raw, and honest. On the streets, other homeless veterans began sharing their own stories. They spoke of battles fought not just overseas, but here at home, against paperwork, against bureaucracy, against the demons that follow them home. Their voices, usually ignored, found new listeners who were ready to hear the truth. A retired business owner watched the growing story on his morning news and remembered the veteran who used to work in his warehouse. A good worker who had disappeared one day without explanation. He picked up his phone and started making calls, determined to find out what had happened to his former employee. In a coffee shop near Trump Tower, two young tech professionals discussed what they had witnessed. Their conversation turned from sharing a viral moment to brainstorming ideas for an app that could connect veterans with immediate resources. They opened their laptops right there and began coding. The veteran's story reached a nurse's break room in a nearby hospital, where a group of medical staff listened intently. One nurse remembered the combat medic training she'd received years ago and wondered why those skills weren't better utilized in civilian healthcare. She started drafting a proposal during her lunch break. Social media picked up the story, but not in the usual way. Instead of quick reactions and heated debates, people began sharing their own experiences with veteran family members and friends. The comment sections, usually filled with arguments, transformed into spaces where people offered help and shared resources. A local news reporter who covered the story found himself diving deeper than usual. Instead of just reporting the facts, he began investigating the broader issues of veteran homelessness. His research led him to other veterans with similar stories, each one adding another layer to the growing narrative. By afternoon, the ripples had reached City Hall. A council member who had served in the military recognized the opportunity to turn this moment into momentum. Without waiting for the next scheduled meeting, she began drafting proposals for immediate action on veteran housing and employment. The street vendor who had first offered coffee found his cart surrounded by people wanting to hear his first-hand account. He told them not about the former president or the media attention, but about the dignity he had seen in the veteran's eyes, about the importance of seeing people as human beings first. Back at the Plaza Hotel, the veteran was unaware of the movement she had inadvertently sparked. She was focused on the task Trump had given her, mapping out the real challenges veterans faced and identifying solutions that could actually work. Her military training had taught her to focus on the mission at hand, and right now, that mission was clear. The story continued to spread, not because it was controversial or sensational, but because it reminded people of something essential, that sometimes the biggest changes start with simply stopping to listen to another person's story. 3 months after that fateful evening, the veteran stood in front of a mirror in her new apartment, adjusting her business suit with the same precision she once used for her military uniform. The transformation wasn't just in her appearance, it was in her eyes, which now held a spark of purpose that had been missing during her time on the streets. Her new job at the security firm had started the day after her meeting with Trump. The company's CEO had recognized not just her military experience, but her unique perspective on what veterans truly needed. She wasn't just working security. She was helping design a comprehensive veteran hiring program that would be rolled out nationwide. The apartment, modest but comfortable, was filled with morning light. On her desk sat a laptop filled with proposals and plans, each one aimed at fixing the broken systems she had experienced firsthand. Her military backpack still sat in the corner, not out of necessity now, but as a reminder of where she'd been and why her current mission mattered so much. Her phone buzzed with a message. Another veteran had been successfully placed in a job through the program she'd helped create. These messages came more frequently now, each one representing another life turning around. Another soldier finding their way back from the edge she knew all too well. She picked up her travel mug, a gift from the street vendor who'd offered her coffee that night. He'd become a regular point of contact, helping identify veterans in need and connecting them with the new support network that was growing stronger each day. His cart had become an unofficial information hub for veterans seeking help. The security firm had given her a corner office, but she rarely used it. Instead, she spent most of her time in the field, meeting veterans where they were, in shelters, on streets, in hospitals. Her combat medic training had taught her that sometimes you had to go to where the wounded were, and this wasn't so different. As she headed to work, she passed the doorway where Trump had found her. It looked different now. Someone had installed a small plaque dedicating the spot to homeless veterans. But more importantly, it was empty. Through the new programs they'd created, every veteran who had once sought shelter there had been connected with housing and support. At the office, her team was already gathering for their morning meeting. Many of them were veterans themselves, each bringing their own experiences and insights to the mission. They didn't just process paperwork. They solved problems, cut through red tape, and made things happen with military efficiency. The wall of her workspace was covered with a large map marking the locations of veteran resources across the city. Red pins showed problems to solve, green ones showed successes. Every week, more red pins turned to green, each one representing another victory in their ongoing mission. Her computer screen displayed the latest statistics. Hundreds of veterans connected with housing, jobs, and medical care. But she knew these weren't just numbers. They were people, each with their own story, each deserving the same chance she'd been given that night. Trump called regularly, not for publicity, but to check on progress and offer support when needed. Their conversations were always focused on results: how many veterans helped, what obstacles remained, what resources were needed next. He kept his promise about cutting through red tape, making calls and opening doors whenever the mission required it. The veteran community had embraced her as one of their own, not just for her military service, but for her understanding of their struggles. When she spoke at veteran events, she didn't just share her story. She offered hope backed by real solutions, concrete paths forward instead of empty promises. Her office whiteboard was filled with new ideas and initiatives: a streamlined system for translating military medical credentials to civilian certifications, a housing program that understood the unique needs of veterans with PTSD, a mentorship network connecting struggling veterans with those who'd made the transition successfully. Looking out her office window at the city skyline, she thought about how much had changed in 3 months. But more importantly, she thought about how much was still changing, how many more lives could be transformed if they kept pushing forward, kept fighting for those who had fought for their country. She picked up her phone to make the first call of the day. Another veteran needed help, and she was ready. After all, this wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission, and she was back in the field where she belonged, serving in a different way but with the same dedication that had driven her entire military career. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of a prestigious New York hotel buzzed with anticipation. The veterans stood backstage, adjusting her notes one last time. Through the curtain, she could see hundreds of faces: business leaders, government officials, and most importantly, veterans whose lives had been changed by the program that started with a chance encounter. Her hands, once uncertain from nights spent in the cold, now moved with confidence as she organized her speech cards. The medals on her lapel caught the light, not her military decorations, but new ones awarded for her work in transforming veteran care across the country. Trump sat in the front row, looking exactly as he had that night a year ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him sat dozens of business owners who had joined the mission, offering jobs, housing, and support to veterans in need. The street vendor who had first offered her coffee was there too, now running a citywide network of volunteer support for homeless veterans. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The spotlight felt different from the harsh street lights she'd stood under a year ago. She looked out at the audience and saw not just observers, but partners in a mission that had grown beyond anyone's expectations. 1 year ago, she began, her voice steady and strong. I was invisible, just another forgotten veteran on the streets of New York. The room stayed silent, hanging on every word. But someone stopped to listen. Someone chose to see me not as a problem to solve, but as a person who could help solve problems. She shared the numbers: thousands of veterans housed, employed, and supported. But more importantly, she shared the stories. The combat pilot who now flew commercial jets, the infantry surgeon who'd opened a successful business, the military nurse who now ran a medical clinic specifically for veteran care. The presentation screen behind her showed images of transformed lives: veterans moving into new homes, starting new jobs, reuniting with families. Each picture represented not just a single success, but a ripple effect touching countless lives. "We didn't just create a program," she continued, gesturing to her team seated nearby. "We created a movement, a way of showing veterans that their service doesn't end when they take off the uniform. It just takes a different form." In the audience, phones stayed in pockets. This wasn't a moment for social media. It was a moment for real connection, for understanding the power of human dignity and the importance of second chances. She explained their next phase: expanding the program nationwide, creating a network of support that would reach every veteran, no matter where they were. The plan wasn't just ambitious, it was revolutionary in its simplicity. It focused on direct action, immediate response, and treating veterans with the respect they'd earned. Trump stood as she finished speaking, leading a standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like a commitment. A room full of people promising to continue the mission. The veteran looked out at the crowd, remembering the loneliness of that doorway a year ago, marveling at how much could change when people chose to care. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans. But this wasn't just another charity event. It was a war room where strategies were formed and missions were launched to help more veterans find their way home. The veteran found a quiet moment to step outside, looking up at the same stars she used to see from the streets. But now, they didn't look cold and distant. They looked like possibilities, like points of light guiding the way forward. Her phone buzzed. Another veteran had just been found on the streets, another chance to make a difference. She smiled, ready to get back to work. After all, the mission wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. This wasn't just a story about one veteran's journey from homelessness to hope. It was a story about how a single moment of genuine human connection could spark a movement that changed thousands of lives. And somewhere in the city, another veteran was waiting, hoping someone would stop and listen to their story too.